For our final presentation of the day, we move from the screen to the streets. It is my pleasure to introduce Mateja Fajt, joining us from Ljubljana, Slovenia, for her lecture, Political Constructions of Costume from Screen to the Streets.
Thank you, Due. Hi. I also want to share my screen. Firstly, let's try like this, share, allow. And I am sharing a screen, right? Yes, okay, I see nodding. Full screen mode, so it's maybe better. Hi, so my name is Mateja Fajt. I'm a researcher and a costume designer, and I focus on theory and also practice of costume design. Thank you so much to the organizing team for inviting me and all the work, especially to Due. I imagine it was not so easy to get us all together, but thank you so much for being a part of this wonderful presentations today. I want to talk today about the political potential of costume. So how costume is used in political actions, but also how to think about costume in a political way. I will mostly focus on protest actions, but I also want to expand at the end and look at political notions of a classical costume design. Firstly, I want to lay some foundations. And talk about how costume is actually conceptualized. Because while costume is artistic field, so it operates in the world of theater, film, opera, and so on, costume itself is much more. Because if we understand costume as performative attire, or as Ify Monk states, costume is a body that can be taken off, there are also many examples of costume outside artistic institutions. So when we think about costume, it's not just what we see on screen on our stage, but sometimes in daily life as well. I'm sure many of you have also experienced costuming, maybe in your childhood, by carnival dress up, the masquerades, and all this. I want to show this on an example of Handmaid's Tale. It's a TV series in the dystopian future. This is an example of an artistic costume. It's in a medium where these costumes are designed and created for to be shown on film and on screen. Well, this is there are these two examples from just last week. One is No King's protest in the US, and the other is from Germany against deepfake technology that targets women. And both of these examples have the analogy with the idea of the TV series, so this limiting of women's rights and targeting reproductive freedom. But here the costume is used on a protest as a way to kind of visually enhance and send a message. So when the costume occurs in the practice of everyday life, it can become a political tool. I use this term costume of conflict to capture contemporary practices of costuming that are subversive and political. I focus on costumes that can create, mediate, or take active part in conflict situations. Because many political movements from grassroots to even mainstream use this kind of visual iconography and also clothing to build their collective identities. I'm not so much interested in these symbolic messages, but how can costume be used as kind of a tactic, as a medium? Because costume inherently carries action. It carries a change, this metamorphosis to come from the costume to uncostumed body. And this element of participation is quite strong, whether be it by making your own costumes or by wearing it to participate in kind of event or a protest or something like this. But if I'm going back to, if we think actually what is the main element that is often taught and often thought of when dealing with costume, if I'm coming back to Handmaid's Tale, is that costume, especially in the artistic field, puts the clothing in very contradictory positions. So costume should constantly negate itself. It should not be seen as a costume. It should be read as a dress and function as a dress. But then on the other hand, costume outside of these artistic spheres, for example, in fall costumes or cosplays or parade, is very dominant. There you see the costume, it's really present. It should really explicitly represent like a historical or a cultural body. But both type of these examples, whether it be a carnival or a TV series, there is a consensus around costume, meaning that the wearers and also the viewers expect this costume to happen. This is like a social interaction. There is a shared consensus. But while costume of conflict often defies this consensus by appearing in unexpected situation. So it functions like a method to break the routine, to disrupt the situation, and participants are not really aware that maybe these costumes will happen. To quote Rachel Hahn, to engage in an act of costuming is to consciously skew or other the normative practice of appearance. I offer here this example of the clown army. It's an activist group, or rather a tactic that uses these elements of clowning, of dressing up using clown makeup during very high conflict protests, like for example, the G8 summits, where there's a lot of police, there's a lot of tension, and they use this tactic of tactical frivolity to not just protect the protesters, but also to subvert these expected behaviors of the concept of protesters. So how is activism supposed to look like? How are protesters supposed to look like? How are they supposed to behave? So I think that this picture really depicts how this tactic is used in practice. So it's the performance studies that have actually opened the door to comprehending costume as interdisciplinary and exclusive. Because in performance theory, to quote Schechner, any action that is framed, presented, or displayed is performance. While this offers great potential for really wide understanding of costume, it also works against it, because it is very hard to classify every action, every dress as costume. To explain it a bit more, how to think about costume, because there's a costume as a symptom of dressing, like referencing Erving Goffman's theory of presentation of yourself in everyday life, where everyday choices, what we wear, feel very natural and automatic, but are actually very much shaped by social expectations that we absorb over time. But this, through repetition, this daily repetition, becomes kind of unconscious habit. It's a disciplined performance that we don't no longer recognize it as a performance, so it's no longer a costume. While costume as an extra daily practice is much more deliberate, so meaning when somebody consciously transforms their appearance to signal that they're taking part in something, for example, in a drama play, or in a celebration, or even in this kind of protest. So everyday dressing frames this body as like a single, very predictable unit, with many these kind of disciplinary mechanisms of self-control. But costume has this power to kind of deconstruct this predictability by breaking the unity of wearer's identity. And we see this with the police and the protesters on this picture, because the police have this very unified body. They're representing themselves, their functions, while protesters, on the other hand, our function is like unpredictable crowd of identities. And they're hiding of identities, but more even so with playing, not just with costume, but the concept of identity is seen as a very subversive act in a way. And there are many ethnological studies that kind of dwell into this relation between costume and identity, so that the main function of costume is to express wearer's identity, not just to hide it, but to kind of communicate the deep sense of themselves. So this is, if I come to the tactic of tactical frivolity, which we've seen with the clowns, it is something similar that is here with the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence, znači Sestra Vječne Radosti. It's another tactic which is used by International Order of Queer Activists to dress as these extravagant nuns with white face paint to protest religious homophobia and raise awareness of LGBTQ issues that is already from the 80s. And this is also interesting, not just because they take part in the protest, but they also do stuff that nuns do. For example, they do community organizing, they do crowdfunding, like the charity and the fundraisers. So they're not just questioning on how what are nuns expected to do, but also what is anticipated in the kind of a sphere of grassroots activism. So this is kind of, they're subverting these categories, not just male, female, violence, non-violence, but also fun and activism. And they're using costume to also to subvert this kind of dominant cultural codes, using also this kind of religious images. So costume of conflict should not really be aestheticized. It's not the idea that that the clothes are what the rebels wear on the protest. It comes from an act, it comes from a relation. So costume is in conflict with someone or something, more precisely with the establishment. And there are different levels of how this conflict can happen, and I will present some examples more. Here we have a slide from the early 2000s, from the Tutte Bianche or Disobbedienti from Italy. These are examples from very highly conflict-oriented situations. So there's very high potential for conflict, and costumes in this situation is a part of confrontation. It can be used as a method to achieve a certain goal. And as you can see on this picture, it becomes more than a costume because they also create this kind of voluminous, more than body bodies, actually, semi-objects that enter into a space and kind of extend the human body. Very similarly, this can be seen with angel blockades at pride marches when there is when the prides are faced with far right religious activists. There are people who dress up as angels with these enormous wings to form kind of human shields around marches, so that there is like they are creating a safe space. Most famously, this started even in the 90s in the US after murder of a young gay male, because they were faced with even on the funeral of this young gay, they were faced with kind of Christian violence. So this was a way of how they physically protected the people who were mourning. They protected the LGBT community. And if I'm connecting now my talk a little bit with Sophia about this symbolism, actually, with the angel wings, there's this notion of purity, of positive intent, but also this idea that angels are the protective ones. So again, we have these constructs that are coming into the space that are actually extending the body and are creating kind of a space rather than just being a costume that is just part of the body. They're actually extending it and entering also the space. There are also costumes that this is another example, like very similar, just white fabric, white sheets, and extended rods that kind of carry a message, but also function as a method to kind of create this safe space. There are also costumes that by themselves carry this subversion. That is because the clothing itself might be recognized as violent or as sexual or as militant. And this is example that I want to offer is the slut walk that plays with the concept of morality. So this is this movement that combats the logic of rape victims being blamed because they were asking for it, to quote, with their clothes. So they organize marches where people, mostly women, wear explicitly sexual clothes that are perceived as indecent. And this is a method of taking a really this negative stereotype, affirming it, and by doing so, it removes the power from the power players. So, and it empowers the ones that before had no power. And here, the costume plays with this image of intimate, everyday clothing of individual and amplifies it and puts it to a point of kind of hyper-realism. So it becomes a costume. And wearing this type of clothes as costume is subversive in a way that it demands legitimacy for these outfits, not just on the streets, but also in private spheres. And it underlines the message by being more explicit, by going over with this kind of dresses used as a costume. The last example that I will show today is the Pussy Riot, because I see this as the costumes that kind of, besides other things, also obscure identity. And already this is a point of conflict, because as I said before, the costume breaks kind of this unity of look, appearance, and self. And this is amplified even more in the situation where participants are not expected to wear costumes. This happened, the top right image from the church, when Pussy Riot made their action in the Moscow Cathedral. This was back in 2012. Their image was kind of incompatible with the sacred environment of the cathedral. They wore these ski masks that have traditionally militant connotations, but they were colorful and they clashed together with this colorful dresses. So by wearing this mask and hiding their individual identities, they were formed as a collective. So they communicated really on this political level. And later, when they were also imprisoned and on trial, this costume actually enabled Pussy Riot to become this global icon. It was very fairly easy to be copied. I have some examples here also from Slovenia, from the Czech Republic, but also global-wide. It became a tool for expressing solidarity, for being present in the public space with these illustrations, with these posters, all by just simply copying the image that they created with their costume. So I think that costume can be used as a method of political expression, of a struggle, of communication. But I really wanted us to think that costume is not just a product, is not just a goal, or just a symbol, but it's actually can be also used as a method that evolves, the change, and also it functions very, it can function very politically strong in this kind of environment. While before I finish, I still wanted to also do a little salto and also talk about the other topic that I don't really have time to dwell today much into, but I still want to because it's part of my current research, and I think many of you are also costume design students. So I also wanted to talk a little bit how can we think about a political potential also of costume in artistic levels, so in costume designing. Because often in our regions, I want to talk about the costume and the idea of time. Because in our regions, when we have very low budgets for film and theater often, most of the time we see a lot of contemporary costume design. So it's very modern, it mimics everyday wear, and this costume is often read as really neutral, almost invisible. But there are also historic costumes that are often depicted. But if you look closely, it's very different if you see costumes, for example, from the 17th century, which is very, this kind of pure history, very distant, very decorative, and very safely contained in the past, or this costume, as I call the costume of memory, which is something that deals with the history, the so-called living history, so that being 50 to 80 years ago, something from the 70s, something from the 90s, something that living generations still remember. Because the so-called costume of memory is a very charged space. It lands differently because it's not quite history and it's not quite now. It's a place where personal experience, collective identity, and political emotions are still much alive and unresolved, especially in our regions of former Yugoslavia, much shaped by war. Um, it has a lot of this political potential because audience sees character dressed in fashion of their youth, of their parents' youth, and they're not simply reading a costume, they're really encountering kind of a trigger because they bring their own memories, their own associations, and kind of unfinished feelings. So most of the discussions on political costume stop at representation. So this idea that costume makes visible identities, period. This representation asks who is shown. Well, a more powerful question is what does costume activate? What does it disrupt? What does it produce? And how do people kind of encounter it? Because through costume design process, we can think about how past is actually constructed and how there are many different histories in a way. Also, if you think about the future, we can also understand it in a political way. So who gets to be in the future, what groups, what bodies, because costume is always somewhere between creating a personal body and this society. So it's very important how we imagine the future and how to explore this kind of political potential of utopia through thinking and creating costume design. So thank you. I hope I opened some space for thinking about costume in a political way, not just on streets, but also on screen and in the arts. And I hope it can be useful in the further debates.
Thank you, Mateja, for that powerful look at costume as a political tool and amazing examples that we've gone through your presentation. Are there any questions for our speaker? Okay. Are there any thoughts on the themes we have discussed throughout the day? Okay, as we have no more questions, I would like to offer a final thank you to all our speakers and participants. It has been a privilege to moderate these 6 perspectives. I believe today's symposium has truly shown how appearance is a vital site of identity and resistance. And on behalf of the Symposium Steering and Program Committee, thank you all for your time and your contributions. I wish you all a wonderful afternoon and hope to see you at our next symposium. This symposium is officially closed.